The Medusa Touch wasn't just a supernatural drama, it was a quiet catastrophe disguised as a man's final moments, unraveling from a hospital bed where he never stirs. It slipped into 1978 like an omen whispered too softly to ignore, shaped by a production that battled rewrites, unnerving mishaps, and a performance so intense it seemed to warp the air around it. Even before release, the film carried a strange heaviness, a sense that its story of psychic devastation might be echoing something real. And at its center stood a cathedral collapse, executed with a realism that shocked everyone who saw it. Why did this film feel less like fiction and more like a warning? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about the Medusa Touch. Fact 1. The novel's troubling sense of realism influenced everything that followed. The Medusa Touch began not as a spectacle, but as a work of fiction that felt strangely clairvoyant. Peter Van Greenaway's novel, released in an era saturated with political tension and structural failures, struck readers as uncomfortably prophetic. The book portrayed destruction not as divine punishment or supernatural chaos, but as an extension of human resentment, a concept that resonated deeply with the anxieties of the early 1970s. For many, the novel's disasters mirrored the era's own mounting instability. Producers who reviewed the manuscript sensed this unease immediately. They had expected a thriller. Instead, they encountered a story that treated catastrophe as something logical, inevitable, and disturbingly intimate. Morler's hostility felt less like the invention of a novelist and more like an echo of public disillusionment. That atmosphere of unsettling plausibility shaped every conversation about adapting the book. Studios feared that audiences might interpret the narrative not as fantasy, but as commentary, perhaps too accurate on a world already cracking at the edges. Director Jack Gold saw potential in the discomfort. To him, the horror did not lie in psychic power, but in the clarity of a mind convinced that society deserved to fall. He believed the adaptation should maintain that cold realism, resisting the temptation to embellish the supernatural. Gold pushed for grounded visuals, measured pacing, and emotional restraint, hoping to preserve the novel's unnerving tone. Yet the very qualities that intrigued him created a silent pressure across the production. Actors, designers, and technicians began noticing how the story's melancholy bled into their work. Even before filming began, the Medusa Touch carried a sense of gravity, not mere gloom, but the feeling of a narrative that was documenting something the world was already beginning to experience. And once cameras rolled, that sense of inevitability only intensified. Fact 2. Richard Burton became the film's unmoving center of gravity. Casting John Morlar required more than talent. It required an actor capable of projecting menace while remaining almost entirely still. Early discussions revolved around performers known for charisma or volatile energy, but none could embody Morlar's interior weight. Burton, however, had a gift for turning silence into pressure. When he finally read the script, he understood the role instinctively. Morlar's power lay not in action, but in presence. On set, Burton's approach reshaped the atmosphere. He rehearsed in near total quiet, lying motionless for long stretches, allowing his breath to become faint, deliberate. Crew members entering the room often fell silent without realizing why. There was something about the way Burton occupied the hospital bed that erased the usual rhythms of filmmaking. A set decorator described it as standing beside someone who wasn't asleep but wasn't entirely here. Other actors adjusted their performances accordingly. Ventura adopted a sharper, more analytical tone, as if interrogating a void that resisted comprehension. Remick found her dialogue taking on an unintentional hesitancy, the natural result of speaking to a face that refused to respond. Burton's stillness became a kind of gravitational field, subtle but inescapable. Even technicians felt the shift. A camera operator reported that Burton seemed to pull depth out of every shot, an effect created not by technology but by the energy he brought into the frame. Lighting specialists remarked that scenes with Burton felt heavier, as though the air itself had condensed. Burton never attempted to explain his process. He trusted the silence to speak for him, and that silence, once embedded into the film's foundation, would color everything the production attempted next, including the unsettling string of incidents that soon followed. Fact 3. A pattern of accidents created a quiet sense of alarm. The first mishap on set appeared harmless. A camera jammed during a routine tracking shot. The second was dismissed as coincidence, a surge in a lighting grid that forced a retake. But by the third incident, unease began to spread. Equipment consistently malfunctioned during scenes tied to Morlar's destructive memories, not dramatic failures, but subtle glitches that disrupted the rhythm of filming. A scaffolding plank giving way under a stunt coordinator was the moment the crew grew genuinely unsettled. Safety checks confirmed no structural weakness. The plank should have held easily. When it broke, narrowly avoiding injury, even the most skeptical team members exchanged glances. Someone jokingly blamed the film's subject matter, but the laughter was thin, uneasy. Technicians began tracking the issues and noticed an unnerving pattern. Disruptions clustered around scenes depicting psychic influence or catastrophe. A playback monitor distorted only when framing Burton's motionless figure. A prop cabinet toppled during a rehearsal and settled into a position that mirrored a storyboard sketch unintentionally. None of these incidents were catastrophic, but the repetition wore on nerves. Gold tried to keep the atmosphere rational, reminding everyone that productions attract coincidence simply through scale. But privately, he acknowledged the timing felt uncanny. Crew members entered the set with a new caution, as though bracing for something nameless. No one believed the story was manifesting itself. Superstition found no foothold in a crew of seasoned professionals. Yet the alignment between fiction and disruption became impossible to ignore, and with the cathedral collapse sequence approaching, tension settled over the production like dust, waiting for a single tremor to rise. The set had not yet seen its most ambitious challenge, but it had already begun to feel the weight of Morlar's presence. Fact 4. The director tried to shape a film that resisted control at every turn. Jack Gold entered the project, convinced he could mold the Medusa Touch into a disciplined psychological thriller, but the film pushed back against him from the start. Gold's strength lay in stripped-down storytelling, in letting silence and implication carry weight. Yet the adaptation demanded a merging of two competing energies: Gold's preference for subtlety and the studio's insistence on spectacle. That conflict seeped into every stage of production. Meetings often turned tense, as executives questioned whether the film was too restrained, urging Gold to amplify Morlar's abilities with bigger visual cues. Gold refused, arguing that the narrative's terror came not from kinetic displays, but from a worldview steeped in bitterness. His approach was methodical, almost austere, and his meticulous revisions reflected a desire to maintain emotional clarity amid chaos. As filming progressed, Gold's demeanor shifted. Crew members observed him pacing alone after takes, reviewing notes in silence, recalibrating scenes as though wrestling with an invisible opposition. He became protective of tone, trimming dialogue and directing performances with a surgical precision that heightened the film's oppressive mood. Some found it invigorating, others found it unsettling, as if the production itself had adopted Morlar's fatalism. The tension extended beyond creative disagreements. Gold sensed that the narrative's undercurrent, the idea that destruction emerges subtly, inevitably, was influencing the atmosphere on set. He once remarked that the film threatened to collapse inward if mishandled, a comment that struck crew members as oddly literal given the incidents already occurring. By the time preparations for the cathedral sequence began, the production felt like a pressure system tightening around him. Gold's greatest challenge was no longer simply executing the story, it was preventing the film from becoming overwhelmed by the mood it generated. And the cathedral sequence would test that resolve more than anything he had directed before. Fact 5. The script survived a gauntlet of rewrites and conflicting visions. Before the first scene was filmed, the script endured a series of revisions that nearly reshaped the story beyond recognition. From the outset, Gold favored ambiguity, a narrative defined by internal violence rather than flashy supernatural rules. But the studio feared audiences might find the story too opaque, too cerebral, too lacking in traditional cause and effect logic. They pushed for clearer motivations, scientific explanations, and a more heroic framing of Morlar's past. Multiple writers attempted to reconcile opposing demands, producing drafts that softened Morlar's misanthropy or inserted exposition to rationalize his abilities. Gold rejected these attempts, arguing they compromised the character's psychological complexity. He maintained that the film's power hinged on refusing definitive answers. Once you explain him, he reportedly said, you diminish him. The cathedral collapse became the focal point of debate. Some executives insisted the sequence be cut or reduced, fearing controversy, cost overruns, and accusations of insensitivity. Gold countered that the collapse was the story's emotional apex, the moment where Morlar's worldview manifested physically. Removing it, he argued, would leave the narrative without a spine. Through countless drafts, the script evolved into a precarious balance between thematic austerity and studio-mandated spectacle. The resulting tone, bleak, deliberate, unyielding, was unlike the typical supernatural thrillers of its era. It was a story built from contradictions, ambiguous yet forceful, introspective yet catastrophic. The final draft bore the marks of every battle fought over it, and those scars would ripple into production, shaping performances, pacing, and the film's uncanny stillness. But the greatest test of the script's ambition came when the team attempted to bring its most challenging scene to life, a destruction sequence too realistic for anyone's comfort. Fact 6. The cathedral collapse was engineered with such precision it became disturbingly convincing. The cathedral collapse remains the Medusa Touch's defining image, a feat of practical effects that astonished even those who constructed it. The miniature was built with unusual density, designed to mimic the stress points of real stone architecture. Gold insisted on authentic physics, believing emotional impact depended on weight, fracture, and dust, behaving as they would in a true structural failure. When the detonation occurred, the results exceeded expectations in unsettling ways. Instead of toppling theatrically, the model buckled with a sickening realism. Beams snapped inward, debris cascaded in chaotic waves, and a plume of dust surged outward like a living organism. Playback footage revealed a collapse disturbingly akin to newsreel disaster footage. Crew members watching the monitors went silent, not triumphant, unsettled. Early preview audiences reacted with visible discomfort. Some questioned whether the footage depicted an actual tragedy. Journalists accused the production of exploiting traumatic imagery. Religious organizations demanded explanations about how the scene was filmed. The studio, initially concerned about cost, now worried about perception. Gold defended the scene, arguing that sanitizing destruction would betray the story's psychological truth. But the controversy became unavoidable. The collapse overshadowed every other aspect of the film's release. It transformed a modest thriller into an object of scrutiny, fascination, and unease. The sequence's unintended power intensified the already tense atmosphere on set, shaping how cast and crew approached the remaining weeks of filming. And as public pressure mounted, the production found itself forced to navigate not just creative challenges, but moral ones. The backlash, however, was only the beginning because the film's psychological weight would soon reveal itself in the reactions of those who viewed it. Fact 7. The backlash began before anyone saw a full cut. Public reaction to the Medusa Touch started months before the film even reached theaters. Rumors circulated that the production had created a sequence so disturbingly realistic that even internal reviewers questioned whether it was ethically appropriate to depict. These whispers reached religious leaders, architectural associations, and civic groups, fueling speculation that the film's portrayal of a collapsing cathedral crossed moral or cultural lines. Studio representatives attempted to dispel concerns, but the ambiguity of the reports only intensified curiosity and alarm. Tabloids seized the story, framing the film as dangerously provocative. Headlines suggested it might re-traumatize viewers who had lived through real structural failures, or worse, that it might inspire new fears in a public already uneasy with the stability of aging buildings. The studio insisted the footage used miniatures, yet early promotional material, with its stark, documentary-like imagery, convinced many that something more unsettling lay beneath the surface. Test screenings only amplified the controversy. Several viewers left their seats during the cathedral collapse, unable to stomach the weight of its realism. Those who remained described feeling physically tense, as if witnessing a historical tragedy rather than a cinematic illusion. The discomfort wasn't rooted in gore, there was none, but in the precision of destruction. It felt plausible, familiar, and uncomfortably close to reality. Gold refused to trim the scene despite pressure. For him, the collapse was the story's emotional fulcrum, the precise moment the audience must confront the depth of Morlar's disdain for the world. Softening it, he believed, would betray the film's psychological integrity. But the wave of early backlash marked a turning point. What began as a modest thriller had transformed into a public spectacle of moral concern, shaping expectations long before audiences saw the completed film. And that concern would soon shift toward the performer whose silence unsettled even the most seasoned professionals. Fact 8. Burton's motionless performance created a pressure no one expected. Richard Burton's portrayal of John Morler is often praised for its eerie restraint, but those who worked beside him experienced something deeper, a presence that altered the energy of any room he occupied. Preparing for long sequences in which he lay motionless, Burton entered a state of extreme focus. He controlled his breathing, softened his facial muscles, and suspended movement so completely that even seasoned makeup artists forgot, temporarily, that he was conscious. Performers accustomed to reciprocal emotional exchange found themselves adapting to this unnatural stillness. Ventura described acting opposite Burton as interrogating a consciousness that refuses to surface, while Remick admitted the silence required her to access a different emotional register. Their scenes gained an unplanned fragility, a sense of tentative communication between characters who were each navigating their own psychological landscapes. Crew members reported equally intense reactions. A camera operator claimed that framing Burton felt like capturing gravity, describing a heaviness to the footage that emerged without any technical explanation. A lighting technician recalled hesitating before adjusting lamps near Burton, unsure why the proximity felt intrusive. Even the script supervisor, a firm realist, confessed that Burton's presence made her increasingly aware of the film's darker themes. The effect was cumulative. Burton's performance didn't simply enhance scenes, it reshaped the production's emotional climate, reinforcing the film's core idea that Morlar's influence radiated outward even while his body remained inert. His stillness became more than acting, it became an anchor, a quiet pressure that tightened as production progressed. And that tension only deepened as another sequence, one far more technically volatile, approached. Fact 9. The plane crash nearly spiraled into a real emergency. While the cathedral collapse stole public attention, the miniature plane crash posed the most immediate danger to the production. The effects team constructed a scaled aircraft rigged with carefully measured pyrotechnics, designed to simulate a mid-air ignition with controlled precision. But on the first test, the explosion expanded unpredictably, melting part of the support structure and filling the effects stage with hazardous smoke. Crew members evacuated quickly. Shaken not by injury, none occurred, but by how violently the test had deviated from calculated expectations. Safety inspectors later reviewed the incident and concluded that the reaction did not align with the projected burn rate of the materials used. Though the official explanation pointed to an instability in the miniature's internal components, technicians privately sensed something more elusive at play, a feeling that the film's recurring pattern of mishaps was entering more dangerous territory. Gold, nevertheless, insisted on a second attempt. He believed the realism of the crash was essential to conveying Morlar's reach, and he pushed the team to refine calculations with near-military precision. The reshoot succeeded, producing footage that captured an arc of destruction chilling in its authenticity. However, the strategy came with consequences. Broadcasters in multiple countries reviewed the footage and expressed concern about airing it during promotional campaigns. Some felt it evoked recent aviation tragedies too closely. Others argued viewers might mistake it for real news footage. The studio adjusted marketing strategies accordingly, but the sequence's reputation endured. For many involved, the plane crash crystallized the uneasy truth about the Medusa Touch. The more effort they poured into controlling its imagery, the more the imagery seemed to slip beyond control. And this realization only sharpened the psychological weight pressing down on the film's cast. Fact 10. Lee Remick anchored the film. While filming under constant psychological pressure, Lee Remick brought an unusual mixture of precision and emotional intelligence to the role of Dr. Zonfeld, yet nothing in her prior experience prepared her for the atmosphere surrounding the Medusa Touch. Most of her scenes required a calm, analytical presence, but beneath that controlled performance was a growing tension shaped by the production's increasingly unpredictable environment. Working opposite Burton, whose stillness carried an eerie, almost oppressive undertone, forced her into a mode of acting that relied heavily on internal restraint. She later admitted that speaking lines to someone who hardly breathed created an involuntary tightening in her chest. Compounding the difficulty were the unexpected disruptions that seemed to erupt around her scenes. A dropped light filter shattered during an emotional confrontation. A metal tray of surgical props clattered to the floor during a quiet monologue, breaking her concentration. Even a wardrobe rack toppled without clear cause one morning, landing inches from Remick's mark. None of these incidents caused injury, but the pattern became unsettling. Crew members exchanged careful glances, avoiding jokes that might undermine morale. Remick responded with professionalism, but her performance began absorbing the stress. Her tone grew quieter, her movements more deliberate, as if her character were navigating a psychological minefield rather than a clinical investigation. Gold noticed the shift and encouraged her to lean into it. He believed the film required the kind of fear that doesn't raise its voice. Her portrayal ultimately became essential to grounding the story. Without her restraint, the film's dread might have felt overbearing. Instead, Remick created a fragile balance, rationality under siege by forces she could not name. And just as she adapted to the strain, the production uncovered a mystery that unsettled the crew more deeply than any malfunction. A prop notebook that seemed to contain thoughts no one remembered writing. Fact 11. The notebook prop took on a life of its own, unsettling even the skeptics. Morlar's notebook was designed as a psychological artifact, a window into a mind obsessed with catastrophe. The art department produced dozens of handwritten pages reflecting bitterness, alienation, and cryptic speculation. Everything was approved, cataloged, and verified. Then, several weeks into shooting, the continuity team noticed pages that hadn't existed earlier. The handwriting differed slightly, the tone was far darker, and the content hinted at events the crew hadn't yet filmed. One entry described a tower giving way under pressure, echoing storyboard sketches for an upcoming scene. Another referenced the day the ground buckles, an unsettling parallel to the miniature plane crash tests occurring days later. When questioned, every member of the art team denied adding the pages. No cast member admitted involvement either. The new writing seemed to have appeared without origin, raising the uncomfortable possibility of a misfiled journal being mixed in with the prop. But the thematic alignment felt too precise for coincidence. Gold, intrigued rather than alarmed, allowed the pages to remain. He believed the notebook's shifting content enhanced Morlar's mystique, giving the character an intellectual presence even when immobile. The crew did not share that enthusiasm. A makeup assistant refused to handle the book afterward, claiming the ink smeared on her fingertips even though the pages were supposedly months old. A props technician reported feeling watched while reorganizing the materials surrounding the journal. The deeper mystery wasn't whether the pages were fabricated, any prankster could attempt that, but why they reflected scenes none of the department heads had discussed publicly. The eerie synchronicity revived murmurs about the production's strange pattern of coincidences, and the unease around the notebook set the stage for the most defining decision of the film's final act: how to end a story that seemed determined to resist closure. Fact 12. The ending was re-engineered to preserve the film's most haunting question. The ending of the Medusa Touch is one of its most enduring features. A flat line, a breathless pause, and then a single faint beep. That sound transformed the film from a straightforward thriller into a lingering riddle. But this wasn't the original plan. Early drafts concluded with Morlar's death, followed by a procedural wrap-up that tied every narrative thread into neat resolution. Gold found this approach empty, arguing that the story's power lay in its ambiguity. Morlar's influence, he believed, should extend beyond his physical body. The studio disagreed. They feared audiences would reject an unresolved finale. Marketing teams worried that ambiguity would complicate promotion. Production meetings became deadlocked, with neither side willing to concede. Meanwhile, filming progressed toward the hospital scenes with no confirmed final shot, leaving editors uncertain how to frame the film's emotional endpoint. Gold's breakthrough came late in the process. Instead of depicting continued destruction, imply it through something minimal, a mechanical response to an unseen spark of life. The pulse monitor, an image grounded in medical reality, would flicker back on. No explanation provided, no dialogue, just an audio-visual suggestion that Morlar's reach persisted. This solution satisfied both sides. Inexpensive to film, rich in symbolic weight, and perfectly aligned with the story's psychological tension. Test audiences reacted intensely. Some felt a chill, others were frustrated, but everyone reacted, which for Gold meant success. The ending refused to confirm whether Morlar survived physically, spiritually, or ideologically. It left viewers caught between dread and curiosity, unwilling to dismiss either possibility. By choosing uncertainty, the film secured its legacy. Audiences would keep debating the meaning of that solitary beep for decades, making it one of the genre's most quietly haunting finales. Fact 13. The makeup team found Burton's stillness more unsettling than any prosthetic. Transforming Richard Burton into a man suspended between life and death seemed like a simple task. Pale foundation, softened features, minimal blood flow shading. But the makeup team quickly discovered that the true challenge wasn't technical, it was psychological. Burton entered each session with a level of immobility that bordered on uncanny. He held his face so still that artists struggled to gauge whether he was consciously controlling his breath or simply slipping into an altered state to inhabit Morlar. One artist recalled brushing pigment along Burton's jawline and feeling an inexplicable chill, as if she were preparing not an actor, but a body awaiting formal inspection. Another described the discomfort of watching his eyelids flutter only once in an hour, a motion so slight she questioned whether it happened at all. Even the senior makeup designer admitted privately that Burton's presence unsettled her more than any horror prosthetic she'd applied throughout her career. Lighting tests only amplified the effect. Under clinical hospital bulbs, Burton's features absorbed shadows in unnatural ways, flattening his expression into something that resembled a death mask. Crew members began tiptoeing around him, speaking more quietly, as if noise might disturb a delicate boundary he was maintaining between awareness and vacancy. Ventura joked during a break that Burton was acting with gravity instead of muscles, but behind the humor lingered a genuine sense of unease. Gold later remarked that Burton had achieved something rare, a performance that created discomfort even before the camera rolled. The deeper he sank into Morlar's silence, the more the production felt as though it were orbiting a void. And just as the crew adapted to this oppressive stillness, an event outside the script shattered their fragile equilibrium. Fact 14. A real structural scare. Mirrored the script at the worst possible time. Midway through production, cast and crew arrived on set to find emergency vehicles parked near the location. A neighboring building had been evacuated after engineers detected instability in one of its support columns. No collapse followed, but the timing was unnervingly precise. That day's scenes revolved around Morlar's childhood fixation on falling structures. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, avoiding the jokes that had accompanied earlier coincidences. Ventura later admitted that walking past the cordoned-off area felt like stepping into Morlar's imagination. Remick arrived moments later and immediately sensed the tension. The silence was heavier than any rehearsal mood. The day worsened when a transportation van used by the props team rolled backward unexpectedly, crashing into a storage fence. No one was injured, but the accumulation of stress wore on the crew. Several technicians, normally skeptical of superstition, began referring to the film as accident-prone, a term spoken half in jest, half as warning. Gold attempted to steady morale by framing the incidents as mere misfortune, yet privately, he acknowledged the unnerving synchronicity. His direction that day reflected a deeper caution. He encouraged shorter takes, quieter pacing, and tighter blocking, almost as if the production itself needed gentler handling. Ventura's scenes took on a sharper edge, his detective persona intensified by the real-world anxiety enveloping the set. Remick, ever controlled, used the tension to deepen her character's introspective calm. Had the incidents occurred on an action-heavy film, they might have passed unnoticed. But on a story about psychic ruin, each coincidence felt like another ripple in a widening pattern, and those ripples would soon shape Ventura's own relationship with the character he inhabited. Fact 15. Ventura became the film's rational anchor while wrestling with its unsettling atmosphere. Lino Ventura approached Inspector Brunel with the discipline of a seasoned actor grounded in realism. He valued clarity, motivation, and emotional logic. But the Medusa Touch forced him into unfamiliar terrain, a world where cause and effect blurred, and the antagonist could not be interrogated in any traditional sense. Acting opposite Burton's motionless presence required Ventura to build tension almost entirely from internal reaction. He later confessed that performing scenes where Morlar never responded made him feel as though he were speaking into a well, a metaphor that perfectly captured the psychological drain of his role. Day after day, Ventura delivered lines into silence, shaping Brunel not as a detective chasing clues, but as a man grappling with the possibility that reason itself might be inadequate. As on-set incidents accumulated, Ventura found the atmosphere affecting his concentration. He grew more meticulous with his script notes, revisiting lines repeatedly as if searching for hidden patterns. Crew members noticed his posture tightening, his gestures sharpening, as though Brunel's frustration was crossing into Ventura's own demeanor. Despite the mounting tension, his performance became the grounding force the film desperately needed. His stoic realism kept the narrative anchored, preventing the story's supernatural undertones from overshadowing its psychological core. Gold often praised Ventura for holding the film in alignment, ensuring its chaos never drifted into melodrama. But Ventura was not immune to the strain. In a rare moment of candor, he admitted to a colleague that the film felt heavy in the bones, a phrase that captured the quiet dread permeating the production. And as filming continued, the team would soon face judgment from an entirely different authority: censors, grappling with a story that refused to offer comfort. Fact 16. Censors feared the film's emotional temperature more than its images. When the completed cut of the Medusa Touch reached the British censors, their concerns had little to do with graphic violence. There was almost none and everything to do with tone. They described the film as permeated with controlled hostility, noting that its disasters felt deliberate rather than accidental. What unsettled them wasn't the destruction itself, but the emotion behind it, a cold, methodical disdain that seemed to seep through every frame. The review board struggled to categorize the work. It wasn't a traditional horror film, nor a typical thriller. Its psychological intensity felt unusually oppressive, anchored by a protagonist whose motivations were never fully articulated. Censors argued that this ambiguity made the narrative more disturbing, not less. The cathedral collapse drew particular scrutiny. Despite knowing it was created with miniatures, several reviewers admitted it was troublingly authentic and feared it would spark public anxiety if presented without context. Studio executives braced for harsh edits. Some believed the ending would be heavily reworked or the collapse shortened. Gold argued fiercely, insisting that ambiguity was the film's core identity. Editing out discomfort, he said, would dismantle its thematic purpose. Surprisingly, the final ruling required only minor adjustments, slight trimming for pacing, not sensitivity. Yet the censors' internal notes revealed a deeper unease. They questioned whether the film might echo societal fears too directly, particularly in a period marked by infrastructure failures and political disillusionment. Their hesitation lent the film an unintended aura of danger. And once the film premiered, a different kind of scrutiny emerged, this time from viewers who believed the fiction on screen had begun echoing events in the real world. Fact 17. Audiences linked the film to real tragedies, giving it an unwanted prophetic reputation. In the months following the film's release, an unusual pattern surfaced. Viewers began writing letters to newspapers and broadcasters claiming the movie had anticipated real disasters. A collapsed facade in Europe, a minor aviation incident in Canada, and a freak structural failure in a small town, none directly resembled scenes from the film, yet the thematic parallels fueled speculation. The idea that the Medusa Touch possessed a predictive quality took hold, not among fringe conspiracy theorists, but among ordinary viewers unnerved by the story's realism. Critics attempted to explain the phenomenon. They argued that the film resonated with contemporary anxieties, prompting audiences to interpret real incidents through Morlar's destructive lens. But psychological theories did little to stem the growing association. Fan discussions emerged, framing Morlar as an archetype of negative willpower. Others proposed that the film tapped into a collective dread already simmering beneath the surface of late 1972 society. Journalists interviewed Gold and Burton about the supposed predictions. Gold dismissed the claims immediately, insisting that the film's events were grounded in narrative logic, not clairvoyance. Burton avoided giving a definitive answer, a silence that reporters interpreted in wildly differing ways. As the legend grew, the movie developed an unexpected cult, following viewers fascinated not only by the story, but by the idea that cinema could mirror the world so closely that it appeared to foresee it. This prophetic reputation, however exaggerated, played a pivotal role in the film's resurgence during the VHS boom, where late-night viewers encountered the movie in atmospheric conditions that heightened its sense of inevitability. Fact 18. Television and VHS resurrected the film and turned it into a cult enigma. Though the Medusa Touch performed modestly in theaters, its second life on home media transformed its reputation. Television broadcasts introduced it to viewers who stumbled upon it by accident, often late at night, when the film's quiet dread felt sharper and more intimate. In the glow of a living room lamp or the flicker of a bedroom screen, Morlar's stillness became suffocating, the cathedral collapse more shocking, and the final beep impossibly louder. VHS tapes amplified this effect. Collectors praised the film's unhurried pacing, its cold realism, and its refusal to provide easy answers. Rental shops discovered the title, circulating steadily among fans of psychological horror and supernatural thrillers. Word of mouth strengthened its mystique. People described the movie not simply as a story, but as an experience, something you didn't just watch, but absorbed. Film magazines in the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds began including the Medusa Touch in lists of overlooked classics. Scholars examining Cold War paranoia cited it as a cinematic reflection of societal fear, the idea that destruction might come not from external forces, but from internal fractures. Gold never witnessed the full extent of this revival, but colleagues recalled his satisfaction that the film found the hour it belonged to. Indeed, the movie thrived in liminal environments, late-night broadcasts, worn VHS copies, and intimate viewings where its psychological weight could settle fully over the audience. Its new status as a cult enigma paved the way for fresh interpretations, and those interpretations centered heavily on one final question: what exactly survived in that hospital room after the screen faded to black? Fact 19. The final beep became one of cinema's quietest but most haunting controversies. The final moment of the Medusa Touch, a single pulse monitor beep interrupting what appears to be Morlar's death, quickly evolved from a stylistic choice into a decades-long debate. On paper, the scene is minimal. No explosion, no dramatic twist, just the faint electronic sound of life returning. But audiences interpreted that sound in wildly different ways, transforming it into one of the most analyzed endings in genre history. Some viewers believed the beep signaled literal survival, arguing that Morlar's consciousness remained intact and ready to extend its destructive reach. Others proposed that the monitor represented metaphor rather than biology, the persistence of hatred, the endurance of ideology, or the dangerous resilience of a world already primed for collapse. A more philosophical camp suggested the beep was a question, not an answer, a reminder that unresolved dread carries more power than explanation. Critics dissected the scene's construction. Gold intentionally framed the moment without visual reinforcement, allowing the sound to function as a rupture in certainty. No close-up, no reaction shot, no guiding cue, just machinery responding to something unseen. This lack of clarity forced viewers into interpretive territory, blurring the line between narrative closure and psychological provocation. The ending's ambiguity helped cement the film's cult legacy. It inspired essays, classroom discussions, and heated debates among late-night VHS watchers. Each interpretation seemed valid because the film never contradicted any of them. Gold's refusal to confirm intent only deepened speculation. What makes the moment endure is its restraint, a whisper, not a revelation, a possibility, not a proclamation. The film ends at the threshold of a new disaster, but never crosses it. And years later, when previously unknown footage was discovered, that ambiguity came into sharper, more unsettling focus. Fact 20. A lost scene suggested Morlar's influence was far broader than anyone realized. When archivists uncovered an unmarked reel containing unfinished footage from the Medusa Touch, they expected minor trims or abandoned camera tests. Instead, they found a sequence that expanded the film's mythology in unexpected and unsettling directions. The scene depicted investigators reviewing a cluster of small-scale incidents occurring simultaneously across London: flickering streetlights, unexplained power surges, minor vehicle collisions, and structural tremors too subtle to register as disasters. Alone, each event seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern, a city subtly bending under an unseen force. The footage implied a continuity of influence, suggesting that Morlar's destructive reach operated constantly rather than episodically. Instead of reacting to emotional triggers or memories, the force seemed ambient, diffuse, woven into the environment. Gold had the sequence shot early in production but ultimately removed it, believing it shifted the story from psychological dread into full-blown supernatural escalation. He argued the film worked best when Morlar remained a man fueled by internal fury, not an omnipresent entity reshaping reality. Crew notes confirmed the footage was cut before effects were finalized, but those who saw the raw material described it as quietly apocalyptic, a portrait of a world beginning to fracture without dramatic spectacle. One editor recalled that the footage made the ending's single beep feel even more ominous, not a revival, but a continuation. Had the scene survived, the film's tone would have changed drastically. Instead of implying a lingering threat, it would have suggested an inevitable unraveling. Gold preserved the ambiguity, but the existence of the deleted material deepened the film's mythos. And for many fans, it offered a chilling possibility. Morlar's story didn't end in that hospital room, it merely paused long enough for the world to catch up. Bonus fact: the forgotten workprint that revealed a darker interpretation of Morlar. For decades, crew members assumed every meaningful scrap of the Medusa Touch had been cataloged, stored, or discarded according to routine. But years after the film's release, a former post-production assistant sorting through mislabeled boxes discovered a battered workprint reel containing material no one recalled reviewing. The footage, grainy and unfinished, presented an alternate interpretation of Morlar's early life, one far more chilling than the scenes audiences eventually saw. The sequence opened in a dim classroom where a young Morlar sat alone after an unspecified accident. Broken glass littered the floor. A toppled desk lay twisted near the wall, but instead of fear or confusion, the child stared at the destruction with unsettling composure. He observed the chaos around him the way one studies an unexpected but satisfying result. No dialogue, no music, only the distant hum of emergency responders outside the window. The shot lasted longer than any editor would normally allow, holding on the boy's blank expression until the image itself seemed to pulse with implication. What made the footage even more disturbing was a later moment, the child calmly flipping through a notebook, sketching shapes that resembled collapsing structures. The drawings bore uncanny similarity to imagery found in Morlar's adult journal, suggesting a continuity of thought that stretched back much earlier than the final cut implied. Gold's handwritten notes on the margin revealed why the scene was removed. Too definitive, removes mystery, makes him pure determinism. Gold believed Morlar should remain ambiguous, a product of trauma, intellect, resentment, or perhaps something darker that defied categorization. Showing his destructive obsession in childhood risked collapsing the story into a simple narrative of predestination. Yet those who viewed the workprint argued it contained a raw, unsettling energy absent from the final film. It suggested a truth too heavy for the theatrical release, that Morlar's relationship with ruin wasn't something learned, triggered, or awakened. It might have always been there, waiting for the world to catch up with him. The workprint was never restored, never screened publicly, and remains locked in archive storage. But its existence lingers like an unanswered question, the final, quiet tremor in a film built entirely on fractures. The world of the Medusa Touch doesn't end when the film fades to black. It lingers, casting quiet echoes that stay with you longer than any catastrophe it depicts. If one fact unsettled you, or revealed a new way of seeing Morlar's story, tell us which one and why. Your perspective might uncover a connection the film never speaks aloud. Share your thoughts below, and let us know which forgotten thriller, cult mystery, or cinematic enigma you want explored next. Join us again as we continue uncovering the stories that hide in the shadows.